Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, today I'm going to talk about the UN and their vote dealing with the United States and the United States' position on Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. Um, Leading up to this vote, you had Donald Trump basically threaten nations who decided to oppose Donald Trump. And before I go into that, let me just say this. Donald Trump broke away from U.S. policy by openly endorsing the idea that Jerusalem was the undivided capital of the state of Israel. And the reason why that's controversial is because, that's one of the key issues that the Palestinians and the Israelis are negotiating over when it comes to this peace process. It's an issue that has remained undecided and undeclared by the United States. The United States is trying to play the role of peace negotiator. So when you're playing that kind of role, you can't take a position on issues that are yet to be decided by the parties. But yet, you have Donald Trump taking unilateral action by declaring that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. And this whole issue is very controversial because, first of all, you have to understand how Israel gained part of Jerusalem. There was a war between the Israelis and Arabs, and during that war, the Israelis defeated the Arabs, and the Israelis literally stole that land, stole East Jerusalem. They continue to occupy East Jerusalem today. It's nothing but thievery. And they use mythology to justify this thievery. And the United Nations, nations around the world have condemned this continued occupation of Jerusalem. But yet, despite the fact that this is stolen land, despite the fact that Israeli has violated international law by continuing to occupy this land, despite all these calls for Israel to go back to the territories that it had before, return that part of Jerusalem to the Palestinians, Israel's defiant. And now you have a Trump administration that is co signing and condoning and publicly endorsing this occupation, endorsing this oppression. But yet they want to play the role of arbiter, yet they want to play the role as negotiator. And that's going to be impossible, man. It's like trying to negotiate. Like I was watching a video of this distinguished scholar, and he's from Iran. I can't remember his name. He wrote a book. I can't remember the title of the book, but when I after this video uploads, I'll put his name and I'll post the video in the description box. I don't want to mess up the information now, but he was basically saying it's like negotiating over a pizza. Like if you're trying to have a negotiation over a pizza, for instance, but yet one of the party is already taken like half of the pizza. That's essentially what you have here, where you have the United States basically giving half of the pizza to the Israelis before the parties can even sit down and negotiate. And obviously, this had an effect. People were outraged in the occupied territories of Palestine. You had demonstrations, and you had the whole Muslim world and most people who are of goodwill and conscience outraged by this decision to declare unilaterally that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. So that's the lead up to this vote. So, in response to that, the UN put this matter to a vote. And leading up to this vote that took place today, you had Donald Trump basically threatening these nations and threatening the United Nations, basically saying that if you vote against us, we are going to remember this. If you vote against the United States, we're going to hold you accountable. And basically threaten to cut away funding from the UN and from various countries that rely on foreign aid from the United States. And despite all those threats, despite all that posturing, these nations, most of the nations of the world said to hell with that. Most of the nations of the world basically gave Donald Trump the middle finger and said, we are going to speak truth to power. We don't care about your threats. We don't care about you threatening not to give us funding. We don't care about your threats not to fund the United Nations. We are going to proceed based on what is right as opposed to being bribed into voting the way you want us to vote. So you had 128 nations vote in favor of this resolution condemning the United States' decision to unilaterally declare Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. And you had nine nations vote against that resolution and 35 that basically abstained. And an abstention just means that those people, those nations, probably didn't want to get caught up into it. They didn't want to have to deal with the consequences. So they decided, well, I'm not going to vote on it so I can avoid like appearing pro Israeli or pro Palestinian. This way I can take a middle ground and all that kind of stuff. So, I just think that that has basically undermined the United States image in the world, by taking this outright pro Israeli position that's going to undermine the peace process. So you have all these nations condemning the United States. Most of the nations in Europe, you have the Middle East and parts of Africa and other parts of the world condemning this injustice, condemning this kowtowing and bowing down to Zionist interests. And I'm glad these nations had the courage to speak out, man. Courage to stand up to the United States despite those ridiculous threats. And this whole situation kind of reminds me of someone who is told to do something ridiculous, like their boss tells them to go do something ridiculous. And that's what I thought about when I saw Nikki Haley giving her address to the United Nations, basically co-signing what Donald Trump said, basically parroting what Donald Trump said, threatening to tie up funds from these different nations and from the United Nations and all that kind of stuff, talking about how we demand more from our investment, referring to the United States, saying the United States invest in the UN and the United States should get something back for that investment. Also, this talking about like how the United States is paying for the privilege uh, of being disrespected. And despite giving that speech right before the vote, those nations stood up and they decided to speak truth to power. And I respect those nations for having that courage, for having the courage to stand up to the United States. And this is the direction that the Trump administration is taking this country in. They are embarrassing the United States before the entire world. You had this idiot, Donald Trump. And I'm sure that Nikki Haley, if I would assume that she's probably thinking this is a dumbass decision that this guy wants me to do, but hey, he's my boss, so I gotta just roll with it. You know how you had a stupid boss that tells you to do something stupid and you try to advise him that it's not a good decision, but he's too stubborn and too ignorant to appreciate your advice. That's the impression that I get from Donald Trump. And that's probably the situation here, man. Because, the whole world basically said to hell with you and we're not afraid of you. We're going to stand up against you. Um, and the fact that he would take this position just tells you how he's like influenced to a degree beyond like what many other presidents have been influenced with respect to these lobbying groups like APAC and other pro-Zionist groups, where they basically have dominion and control and domination over a lot of these politicians, man. And it's just sickening to see the United States put in this position where they are playing the role of servant to the state of Israel. They are playing the role of humble little slave to the state of Israel. And that's despicable, man. It's despicable that you have a president that's willing to put the United States integrity and standing in the world in jeopardy so that he can placate and pacify the Zionist interests in the United States of America. So I just want to thank a couple of the people who tuned in. Shout out to everyone that left comments. I'm gonna have to bring this closer because it's hard to see some of the comments. So yeah, I'll just say shout out to everyone. And I see that somebody says that we are Israel, and I assume that that's along the lines of those the Hebrew Israelites and all that stuff. I won't even get into that discussion right now. I may do a whole video on that subject, or not. I don't want to get into any religious debates or anything like that. But tell me what y'all think in the comment section. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. I want to thank those people who have tuned in. Um, I'm probably going to have some future hangouts, so look out for those. So, with that, I'm going to say peace and blessings to each and every one of you. Peace.